so personality. So your text defines personality as the unique and relatively stable ways in which people think, feel, and behave, right? It's both character, which is really about how people judge your morally relevant behavior. So if you're a good character, that means you're things like moral, dependable, ethical, competent, and so forth. And then here's your temperament, and that's just enduring characteristics that you're supposed to be born with. And when we talk about personality, we're generally mostly talking about temperament. But temperament, when we use that term, we tend to believe it's something that doesn't change. Personality is relatively stable, but we can change some parts of it, depending on the philosophy you belong to. We'll talk about that in a minute. So relatively stable pattern of thinking and behaving that distinguishes you from someone else. So I already mentioned individual differences, and that's really all what personality is about. And we'll see that in the next slide, but I want you to take into consideration distinctiveness. That means each person's personality is unique. There are many separate parts of personality, but the way they come together as a whole makes each person unique. And relative consistency just means it pretty much stays the same throughout your life and in different places. So your American Psychological Association, your APA definition, and you have a link there if you want to go to the PDF document I make available on Canvas. Personality refers to individual differences and characteristic patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving, okay? Individual differences, enduring characteristics that distinguish one organism from another and are stable over time and across situations. Okay, we can talk about individual differences in humility or in moral character, for that matter. You could talk about individual differences in preferences for books versus television and so forth. Just mainly is their difference. Their differences, that means each person is unique and they're fairly stable over time and across situations. So not only as you grow older and etc., but you're basically the same person at home, at work, and so forth, in theory. In reality, of course, we behave differently according to the situation, but our basic personality supposedly does not change. So people who study personality focus both on understanding the individual differences and personality characteristics and how they relate to other things, behavior and so forth, and also understanding how the various parts of a person come together. So, if we talk about big 5 personality factors, which we'll talk about more a little later, but it's openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism, how different amounts of levels or individual differences that each relate and come together in one person who is a unique individual, okay? So we're going to start with Freud and psychodynamic theory, right? And you'll see why. It's fun. Maybe not completely supported by the evidence, but it's fun. And he was one of the first people to talk about it. So we've spoke about Sigmund Freud more than once, starting with the first day. He founded the whole psychoanalytic movement. He was practicing in the Victorian era and basically end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th. So Freudian theory is based on 3 main things that we're talking about now. Psychic determinism. This is the idea. Determinism just means that everything has a cause, okay? And you can't escape it, okay? Past influences present. This means that according to Freud, what happens to you as a child affects your personality for the rest of your life, okay? And it's always there, right? He focused kind of on the instincts, Eros and Thanatos. So Eros is love, Thanatos is death. Okay, Freud believed that a lot of who we are is driven by our seeking love or sex, and then fear of death. So Thanatos. There's fear of death is actually a big topic in psychology. There's something called terror management theory, something that all different psychologists can study. Terror management theory The terror it talks about is the fear of death. So terror management theory is how we manage to deal with the fear of death that supposedly we all have and still be productive members of society and so forth, right? And then Freud talked about levels of consciousness, and we're going to see that in a minute. Vicente, is your phone very interesting? Maybe you should put it down. Otherwise, you never know anything. Okay, so something really important to take into consideration is that Freud was in Europe during the Victorian age. That was a time of a lot of control, societal control, and some important things as far as Freud's theory go. Men were supposedly unable to control their animal urges. Okay, so a Victorian husband would have some children with his wife and then kind of forget about her and have a mistress for all of his pleasure. Women were not supposed to have sexual urges. So mistresses, you know, prostitutes, they were paid. I guess they thought they were pretending, well, they probably were if they were prostitutes. And people who were virtuous, women who were virtuous were not supposed to enjoy sex at all, right? Okay, so these levels of personality, Freud's concept of personality, iceberg, and 3 levels of the mind. So you guys heard tip of the iceberg expression. So Freud thought that all we saw of our personality was the tip of the iceberg. Most of that is of it is made up of the ego and then some of the superego. So the visible part, the tip of the iceberg, that's the conscious mind. That's all we're aware of. And then below the surface, we have id, we have ego and superego, and really submerged, or we can supposedly never access it, is the id. Okay, so what are these things? And unconscious mind. The unconscious, everything underneath the water, right? Underneath the accessible part, all feelings, memories, thoughts, and so forth that we cannot voluntarily access. We cannot easily bring them to the surface. Now, the whole idea of psychoanalysis is that the therapist would help you access these unconscious urges, feelings, memories, and so forth. And for Freud, this untouchable stuff, this inaccessible stuff was the most important factor of who we are as far as our personality, right? So let's start with the id. Remember, the id is that bulk of the part of the iceberg underneath. So it's submerged, it's way underneath the ego and the superego, and it's huge. Okay, that is really driving who we are. Totally unconscious, there from the moment we're born. The id goes by 2 things. First of all, we have the libido. Here's our textbook definition, and sexual energy that may come into conflict with demands of society standards. So the libido is what you want to do. Usually we talk about in terms of sex, right? Libido is just the impulse to do whatever it is, okay? The id functions by the pleasure principle. That is, the id wants the immediate satisfaction of needs and desires without any regard for the consequences. Okay, this is just our pure impulse. We're not even conscious of what's going on there. Remember, it's way down there at the bottom of the iceberg. Now, the superego, in contrast, is really society. It's so part of the personality that acts as a moral center. It's what's telling you what you need to do to get along with society's standards. Okay, your ego ideal is standards for moral and ethical behavior. And then your conscious, we've all heard of a conscious, right? Your conscious is what tells you if you've done right or wrong. You either have pride for doing right or guilt if you do wrong, right? And right or wrong is determined by the ego ideal. The ego ideal is what, according to whatever society you live in, knows the standards for moral behavior, okay? Now, I love, one of the things I like about cartoons is when you have the conscious, they have a little guy and little tiny cartoon characters and pop out someone's head, like somebody's banging with a hammer and somebody's saying, the angel and all those kind of things. We can think of kind of like that. And so we have the id pushing us to just do these animal urges, and then we have the superego telling us how we have to behave to conform with society. And right in between these two is the ego. The ego is the part that we're most unconscious with, that most of the conscious mind, right? That is the tip of the iceberg, is aware of what's going on, right? The ego is our conscious self. And here we have develops our need to deal with reality, conscious, rational, logical, mediator between the id and the superego is right in between there. Now remember the id functions according to the pleasure principle. Okay, let's get what we want as soon as possible, right? The ego functions according to the reality principle. And that means you satisfy your unconscious urges, the demands of the id, only when the superego is in accordance, when negative consequences won't result. Okay, so your id's telling you you want to have sex with a lot of people, and your superego is telling you no, and your ego, it's like, okay, reality here. Okay, superego says we're not supposed to do these things because of society. We want to do these things. Well, we're not going to do them if it's, we're just going to have like one girlfriend, one wife, one boyfriend, whatever. So, your id, let's all run around naked, and then your ego's like, reality, we're going to lose our job. Everybody's going to take pictures of us and so forth. Reality principle. Okay, so another important part of Freud's theory, actually one of the parts of his theories that actually has a little bit more evidence, mostly there's no evidence for this, but this are his psychological defense mechanisms. So unconscious distortions of a person's perception of reality that reduce stress and anxiety. So what's going on here is, in order to live in the world, if you have a whole bunch of bad things going on, you will unconsciously, you're not aware of doing it, but you distort your reality in order to deal with that stress and anxiety, okay? So you might have heard of a lot of these things, and we're gonna go into them in detail. Let's go ahead and go to the next page. And remember, again, unconscious distortions mean that people don't do this on purpose. They're not aware that these are defense mechanisms, unless they've got to have a psychology course and so forth. So the first is denial. You guys have heard about denial, right? We talk about he's in denial, she's in denial. Common thing about Freud is all these defense mechanisms are so embedded in our popular culture that we see them on TV, we see them in movies, we talk about them, we see them in memes, right? So denial, refusing to acknowledge a threatening situation. So you can be in denial about the fact that you're going to lose your house because you're not making enough money to pay your house payments, right? You can be in denial about losing a person, right? You can be in denial about the end of a relationship. Yeah, you guys have heard of that, right? Repression, that means when you just push any thoughts into your unconscious, out below the tip of the iceberg where you can't remember it. Okay, so we did talk about, how you can actually on purpose forget in our memory chapter, right? And that involves like distorting a memory each time you bring it to the surface, and that can be part of repression, but basically repression is unconscious. Again, you just refuse to remember bad things, okay? So your example is not being able to remember sexual abuse, right? Rationalization. So we all do this sometimes. We make up excuses for unacceptable behavior. Okay. So, I did here your example. I can have a piece of cake later. Well, you're not supposed to eat cake if you don't have breakfast. You could say, well, I did it. I had to tell her that lie because if I hadn't, she would have been more upset. That's rationalizing an untruth, right? It's wrong, right? Projection, that just means that when you have thoughts that you don't like, you project them onto someone else as if they have them and not you, okay? So there are examples a little weird. Maria is attracted to her sister's husband, but denies this and believes that he's attracted to her. Okay, but more common is that, you are, you're doubting your relationship, or you're doubting, you're kind of feeling that maybe you're not that interested in your significant other, and rather than acknowledging that in yourself, you start believing that your significant other is not interested in you, okay? Maybe you're thinking about cheating on her or him, and instead of recognizing that in yourself, you accuse your significant other of thinking about cheating on you, okay? That's what projection is. Reaction formation. Okay, this is something else. We don't tend to see the terminology in memes and popular press, but we do see it. Forming an emotion, reaction, or attitude that's the opposite of thoughts or feelings that you don't want to have, right? So the example is something actually we do see in stories and stuff. Kyle is unconsciously attracted to, however you pronounce that. Anybody know how to pronounce that? Sian Chan? I don't know. But outwardly voices an extreme hatred of homosexuals. So we do see this, okay? We see people who nowadays, thank goodness, we are accepting of a lot of different stuff that we weren't before, like homosexuality and other different sexual orientations. But there's still religions and families who are very negative. And so say there's someone who belongs to a religion that's who believes homosexuality is evil, religion, and they have these feelings, but they're not conscious of it, but they are homosexual, but they're stumped. They don't have they're not aware. So instead they express extreme hatred or really homophobic, right? Does that make sense? That's called reaction formation. I'm sure you have heard of this kind of circumstance. The terminology is reaction formation. Okay, displacement. Okay, we actually have already talked about displacement in this class. I think I gave you the examples when you get angry with your boss and you can't say anything, so you go home and yell at your dog or your children, right? That's just directing negative feelings at a target that is less threatening to you, right? Because you're not going to get in trouble for it. Regression, okay, that's when you fall back in your developmental milestones. You fall back to childlike behavior or so forth to cope. So a child has no longer wets the bed, but starts wetting the bed because a new baby comes home and they feel jealousy and so forth. And I'm sure you've also heard regression. Identification, trying to become like someone else to deal with anxiety. So they have the example of Samantha admiring the most popular girl in school and tries to copy her, okay? It can be with anyone, be it with a colleague. You can identification can happen with a colleague, with just about anyone, right? And you're just trying to deal with anxiety or maybe not fitting in. Maybe you're a teenager who doesn't feel like they fit in, so they emulate someone that they think is admirable or popular or so forth. Compensation, substitution, trying to make up for areas in which a lack is perceived by becoming superior in something else. Okay, so I always think when I see this, I think of Shrek. And there's a thing in Shrek, I don't know if have you guys seen Shrek? Yeah, well, there's a place when Donkey is talking to Shrek and they're looking at this, that little guy's big castle. He's like, you don't think he's compensating for something? I remember that. So there you got this example from a film, right? Yeah. Sublimation, turning unacceptable urges into socially acceptable behavior. So this is interesting. This is the idea. So their example is Ryder is very aggressive and becomes a mixed martial arts fighter. That's sublimating to allow himself or herself an outlet for aggression, right? Which is not socially acceptable. And the important thing is here, it's not like you thinking, okay, I've got these violent urges and I'm feeling aggressive, so I want to go to a dojo and sensei is going to teach me how to deal with this and actually train me. That would be too conscious for Freud. He's talking about someone who just is unconscious of this need for an outlet and thinks, oh, I'm going to be able to thump people if I'm in a dojo, right? Important distinction. Because whereas it's quite, it's adaptive to recognize that you need someone to help you control aggressive urges. It's not adaptive to look for a place where you can be aggressive with permission. Does that make sense? You guys get the difference? Yeah? Okay. Okay. Now, Freud had stages of personality development. We've talked about lots of stages so far in this course. Freud had psychosexual stages. So 5 stages of personality development. And if something goes wrong in them, then that's when you have a problem, according to Freud. And they're oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital. Now, what happens if you don't resolve the conflict in a particular stage? You have fixation, and we'll see more about that. So remember we talked about in chapter 8, Erik Erikson, and he had stages of psychosocial development, which had, now I can't remember any of them, even though I teach it, but it's like generativity versus versus every stage had something versus something else. So isolation versus identity formation and so forth. So conflicts in each stage, that started with Freud. Actually, Erikson was a disciple of Freud. We'll see that in a minute. Okay, so let's look at this in more detail. So the first is the oral stage. Okay, this is the first 18 months of an infant's life. The mouth is the erogenous zone. Okay, so the sexual feeling zone, and weaning is a primary conflict. Babies, the main thing they do is nurse and get rid of the, crap and everything, just babies and cry and whatever they do. But the main thing for Freud is that you have to be weaned. The conflict here is weaning, right? If it's from a bottle, if it's from a breast, whatever. Babies are dominated by the id. They don't really have a lot of consciousness there. They're just like, they have the pleasure principle. All they want is their needs satisfied no matter what, right? Next is the anal stage. That's basically your toddler stage, 18 to 36 months. The anus is the erogenous zone, and toilet training is the source of conflict. So if you fail to be weaned in the oral stage, you got a problem. It's going to affect your personality, according to Freud later. If you fail to become toilet trained, then that's something else, or something goes wrong in the toilet training process. According to Freud, we have issues, right? This is when the ego starts to develop at this age. You start to be aware of yourself. You have more of conscious, and the baby is more conscious of what's going on and so forth. So what happens with fixation at this stage? Okay, you can have an anal explosive personality. That's when you don't resolve the toilet training conflict properly and you're messy, destructive, and hostile. Then you have the anal retentive personality, and that's when you have issues there and you're neat, fussy, stingy, and stubborn. Okay, so anal retentive, at least from my generation, I'm Generation X, that's the thing we accuse people of being all the time. Anal retentive is an expression that is in popular culture. Now, as far as I know, anal explosive is not, probably because the disgust factor. Yeah, right, maybe that's why. But certainly we do talk about anal retentive people. And according to Freud, it was because they had some kind of issue resolving the whole toilet training situation. Okay, next is the phallic stage. Okay, that's about 3 to 6, and that's when children discover sexual feelings. Okay, masturbation, and so forth. This is when the superego develops. You start being told, don't masturbate, or whatever you're told, right? Don't, you start being aware of what society is demanding you do, right? So then your ego starts to work between them. So the two fixation things that happen if you don't get through this stage well, at this stage happens is when you have the Oedipus complex and Electra complex. Anybody heard of the Oedipus complex? Okay, this is when a child feels sexual attraction to actually a boy child feels sexual attraction to his mother, right? And jealousy of his father. So Oedipus Rex is a Greek tragedy where Oedipus actually ends up, I can't remember the whole thing about it, but there's a warning like this baby is going to, he is told your son is going to, have sex with his mother or have a relationship with mother. So to avoid that, the king sends Oedipus to a different realm or whatever it is. And this is actually what causes it, because then Oedipus grows up with no knowledge of who his mother is. And when he meets his mother later in life, he actually falls in love with her and marries her and so forth. But of course, that wouldn't have happened if the father hadn't gone to the temple of whatever it was and had this prophecy that changed the life, right? So hence Oedipus complex. Electra complex is the same thing, except for it's little girls falling in love with their father and being jealous of their mother, right? These are typical issues during the phallic stage. Okay, after that is latency. That's when sexual feelings are repressed. Remember repressed? Okay, you've been told so much when you were little, when you were at phallic stage, no masturbation, no this or no that, you got to be proper. Remember, this is Victorian stage. So these are repressed, and you learn math and how to read and all that stuff, right? And finally, the genital stage, that's what we're all in because it starts during and at puberty. And you have sexual feelings reawakened, pop up with appropriate targets. Right, not your mother, not your father, hopefully somebody from the same social class if you're Freud and all so forth, right? So discussion for today, there's a Freudian personality quiz on Canvas, but apparently most people didn't see it. It was in the email I sent and most people did not click on the link. So if you did not, just focus on talking about whether you think all these stages, psychosexual stages, is there an element of truth in them? Do you think it's bogus? What do you think of them? Okay, so what do you think of Freud, the Freudian theory of personality so far? We'll have one tiny in-class group and a tiny online group, and you guys can talk about these. I'll give you 5 minutes. All right, guys, talk about all male class. You can get up and talk. I'll make a breakout room for you guys. Oops.
Professor,
Yeah.
I was going over the chapter 3 materials to follow along, and all that's uploaded is the last portion on like the personality assessments.
Yeah, I never shared the screen with you guys. Really?
No, it's okay.
Okay,
Yeah.
you guys should have said something. So I'm gonna share that screen. I mean, I guess you can kind of see it because of the thing, but it's not good. And I uploaded, I'll make sure what's going on with that link. Maybe the link didn't share well. Go ahead and discuss this and I'll take care. Thanks for letting me know, Mark, and I'll take care of that now.
All right.
Let me put
Thank
you guys in a breakout room and then I'll go do that.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Of course, I have no eyes today. Okay.
But I mean, it's just the same question.
All right, here in case you need to see these. There's the question. You guys want to see another slide? Do you remember it? But
Yeah.
there they are. There's the psychosexual stages, and then you also have the defense mechanisms. I mean, do you think they actually happen?
Slide with the stages on it, like all the stages.
Right there?
Yeah.
There you go.
those I don't know why. Plus, it's just such a unique way to do it.
All right, I sense not much talking happening when we close this room here. There's our 5 minutes anyway. Okay, you guys in here, what did you guys, if I see you weren't too inspired here, but what do you think? Is there some element of truth or what do you think?
It's somewhat on topic, but I found the defense mechanism of enunciation. It's called enunciation.
Identification, yeah.
Just because I think I find this so interesting because it's just such a unique way of dealing with your own stress or anxiety, like you reshape your own personality. I guess.
Yeah.
Instead of avoid basis. Which I mean, looking from the outside in, it's like that's weird to do that. But I could be that person. Think that way.
Right, and it's, remember, it's not really conscious either.
Yeah, that's what I'm also. I wonder if they actually know that like that change.
Yeah. I mean, you're right, because looking at it from the outside, it's look like they're just, okay, they want to be like this, they're gonna be like this. But really it's trying to deal with their own feelings of inadequacy, right? So, and of course, trying to be someone else is not gonna solve your own issues, of course. But, you know, you could also say, well, what's, you know, it's good to want to admire people and want to be more like them, right? I mean, maybe this example, most popular, not necessarily, but in life, we find a lot of people we honestly would like to be more like, at least I do, right? So yeah, that's a good point. It is, you really brought up a good point there. Anything else?
I did the test twice and I got pretty much the same result each time. But I mean, it was just the same question.
Right. And what did you think about the test?
I agree with it for the most part. It said I'm very overly self-controlled, organized, possibly subservient to authority.
Well,
I guess like I do, very in control. Kind of like I'm very organized.
right.
I can tell like which question went with which like section.
Which is always the problem, because you can always tell what they are, right? I mean, I remember I did it and I thought it had some things that might be good, and mainly it was just out of curiosity, but cool. All right, well, thank you. Let me, how about online? Do you guys have anything you wanted to share?
I just took the test right now because I just saw the announcement. I got 73% in the phallic and 70% in the latency stage.
Uh-huh.
And although I think that overall, like the oral, like the actual stages and what they mean are like kind of accurate,
Uh-huh.
I feel like for example, like with potty training, I feel like there's so many different ways to actually do that. So there's so many different ways to quote unquote go wrong. So I don't
Right.
think like an adequate way to like measure it. But I do like believe that there's some validity in it, because as I was reading, the thing is, I was like, okay, I could kind of see where like this could be true. And yeah, I feel like overall, like it's kind of just a little bit maybe exaggerated, maybe, but I feel like it could be potentially like on the right track.
Right. So for for you guys out here, Mark says that's kind of on the right track, although maybe exaggerated a bit. So he says that, yeah, I think he's seeing some elements of truth but he points out that, there's so much that can go wrong. For example, with toilet training, how are you even going to measure it, right? Which is a really good point. And that's part of the main criticism of Freud's theory is there's not a lot of scientific evidence for it, because measuring so much of it is, as Mark points out, is impossible, right? How can you even measure? How can you know what people, if it's unconscious and being repressed, well, how are we going to measure it, right? I mean, yeah, they do have some interesting ways, but basically it's problematic. So let me, get a little confused too. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. Okay. Okay, so Neo-Freudians. These are followers or disciples of Freud who developed their own theories of psychoanalysis. They did use some of Freud's concepts, but they kind of moved away from a lot of things towards other issues. And the most famous is Carl Jung. I think he's also in that film. I showed you guys the trailer of that Viggo Mortensen film, remember at the very beginning? And I think Jung appears in that too. And we have talked about Erikson already. So let's look at these guys. So Jung's main contribution is he had, on top of the personal unconscious, which is what he called Freud's unconscious mind, Jung also thought there was a thing called the collective unconscious. And this was memories shared by all humans, right? Now, this is kind of lack of evidence for that too, right? But it is really interesting. And he talked about archetypes. So collective universal human memories that you could find in all different cultures, like you have the father figure or, whatever. Whenever I see this, I think about Star Wars because, Star Wars, I don't know if you guys watch Star Wars, but I hope you have, it's full of archetypes, right? And you have Luke Skywalker, who definitely has some daddy issues with Anakin Skywalker, right? So definitely also Anakin has all sorts of issues because other things, Star Wars is full of these archetypes and stuff. But yeah, so Jung's contribution, I mean, he's an interesting guy. You could see, also you can read his stuff. He also is evident in popular culture, but the collective unconscious was his main contribution there. Now, Adler, less likely, you guys are less likely to have heard about him. He's the person who really first started talking about birth order and how that might affect our personality, right? He thought that feelings of inferiority were what drove, what drive personality. And this is, we have talked, I'm sure you guys have heard of inferiority complexes, right? Oh, he's got an inferiority complex or she's got this or that. So it's not like Freud and all his followers have had a big impact on us culturally. We see him in, sitcoms and all sorts of TV series, right? References to these things. So birth order theory. Now, Adler thought that because firstborn children feel inferior to younger children, they become overachievers. Why do they feel inferior? Because, either the younger ones receive attention, maybe it's more, maybe it's less, they don't really know, but the firstborn ones are old enough to look and see, hey, my little baby brother or sister is getting all the attention, so I'm going to feel inferior again, not consciously, and then become overachievers. It is true, certainly in my experience, that firstborns tend to be more likely to take responsibility and overachieve in school and so forth. I'm a firstborn. I personally believe it has more to do that your parents are stricter with you, and it's more to do with the circumstances of your parents when you're growing up. Firstborn, your parents are still poor, they're younger, they're still in bad jobs, they're stricter with you, you have to wear hand-me-downs, you don't get a car, and then your baby brothers and sisters, parents making more money, they've been there longer, yes, and they get more spoiled, right? According to Adler, middle children feel superior to the dethroned older children, as well as the younger children, and tend to be competitive. I don't know if that's true. Younger children feel inferior because, so remember, it's all about the inferiority complex. So according to Adler, wherever you're born, you have a different special inferiority complex. So younger children feel inferior because they don't have the freedom or responsibility of the older children. Doesn't say what they do, but they do tend to be more spoiled. But again, it's more about the, yes, there's scientific evidence that birth order matters. Interestingly, for some diseases, that's more probably about aging semen and eggs than about birth order specifically. But yeah, there is some evidence that there are differences. I think we talked about homosexuality. Younger, later born males are more likely to be homosexual than the firstborns. Again, that probably has more to do with genetics than with the order you're born in, but genetics, that it is a thing, right? So moving on. Erikson, we talked about Erikson in chapter 8, right? In developmental, he had the psychosocial stages of development, and his are the only ones that go all the way up to old age. Remember that? Okay, so his theory was about social relationships, the 8 psychosocial stages. We talked about that. Horny. We have not talked about horny. Theory based on basic anxiety. I forgot about penis envy. So according to Freud, what the problem of a lot of us women is that we really want a penis, right? He thought that girls had penis envy. Yeah. What Freud wasn't thinking clearly is what women probably had was envy of what a penis brought with it at the time. So if you had a penis at the time, you could own houses, you could vote, you could do all these kind of things that women couldn't do in Freud's time until he was very old, right? So anyway, Horny said, that's not true. He focused on anxiety. He thought that, a child is born and helpless at first. The child sees everything going on as they grow up, and they want to be able to take some control of their life, and they can't, right? And so they have this anxiety. And if you've been around children, you'll know that little kids really want to do it themselves, right? They want to get dressed themselves. They want to feed themselves and everything. So, and the anxiety is caused by them not being able to do that like the bigger people can. He talked about neurotic personalities. He thought that resulted from, upbringing. So less secure upbringings and maladaptive ways of dealing with relationships, which is kind of close to attachment. Remember, we talked about attachment in chapter 8. Okay. Current take on Freud and the psychodynamic perspective. So remember, Freud is the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. Really interesting stuff, you got to admit, has given us a lot of popular culture stuff, a lot of things to talk about. There is some support for the defense mechanisms. We talked about that, reaction formation, repression, and so forth. And yes, there is some we do not have access for one reason to the other or the other to all of our feelings and thoughts that influence our behavior, right? I'm sure we've all been in that situation where we do something, we're like, what was I thinking? Or I should have known, but we have things that we're not as in touch with as we should. So that's supported. But a lot of it is, it can't even be tested. Okay, remember we talked about in chapter 1 how important, if you have a theory, you need to be able to build testable hypotheses, right? A lot of it you can't test. His interpretation of dreams can't test that, right? Free association, which is lying and just talking, right? Also remember, as I've said before, he based his theory on wealthy women, right? Almost all his theory based on wealthy women who, according to him, were hysterical and had penis envy and all these issues. So just grain of salt with Freud, even though it's so much fun, I always teach it. It's fun to talk about, and you could certainly see, there's elements of truth in it, right? There are definitely elements of truth. So with that said, any questions on Freud? Let's go on to learning theories. Okay, learning theories. So remember chapter 5, way back in chapter 5, we talked about behaviorism and operant conditioning. Most of you hated it because the application assignment 1. So for behaviorists, we learn our personality, right? Set of learned responses or habits. A habit is just something that's really well learned. Okay, so automatic, it has become automatic. So contrast with classical conditioning where what you learn is an automatic response. And behaviorism or operant conditioning, you learn voluntary responses, but after a while, it's so well learned that you don't even have to think about it. So it's automatic, right? And that's what personality boils down to. Excuse me, definitely allergies going on. So we learn. Okay, so how are different ways to learn? So basically, the basic premise is behavior that is reinforced becomes more common. So our habits, whatever we get rewarded for one way or the other, that will become eventually a habit. Social cognitive learning, we talked about this in the sexuality and gender chapter, well, and before as well. Just you learn based on other people's behavior and how they, how you expect things you expect of yourself, right? So social influence, right? We model our behavior on other people's behavior. We've talked about this. Social cognitive view includes cognitive processes such as anticipating, judging, memory, and imitation. Remember, for the behaviorist, that really doesn't really look at that cognitive processes, right? I think I have that right here. So, well, not yet. Bandura had social cognitive. Bandura talked about reciprocal determinism. And we're going to see the next slide cover this, but the idea here is, first of all, determinism, remember, that means everything has a cause and you don't really have free will. You can't step out, you cannot step away from your causes. Something causes your behavior and it's there forever with you, right? So everything is determined, but the way your personality comes out or is determined is it's kind of interaction of your environment, your personal characteristics that you're born with, and the behavior. So when you behave, you actually have an influence your future behavior by the way you behave in the moment. For Bandura, self-efficacy is very important. Bandura, as far as I know, is still alive unless COVID carried him off. I don't remember hearing that. I don't think so. Self-efficacy is how much you believe your behavior is going to work, right? How effective anything you do will be. Self-efficacy is really important. A lot of research has been done on it. People with a high sense of self-efficacy, they have more self-confidence. They're more successful in dealing with different situations, right? Not the same as self-esteem. Self-esteem is just how you value yourself, right? Self-efficacy is really important when it comes to, believing you have to make a difference in your own and other people's lives. Okay, so here's the slide with reciprocal determinism that I was talking about. So you can see your environment, which includes reinforcers and punishment, I suppose, as well. Your personal cognitive factors, so that's what you're expecting of yourself, right? And your own, pre-existing disposition, right? And then your behavior, and they all interact, right? And that is going to determine who you are personality-wise. Okay, now Rotter is someone new. I don't think I mentioned this one, okay? Rotter social learning theory based on motivation. So according to Rotter, people, and to everybody, right? We seek reinforcement, we seek reward, and we want to avoid punishment. No surprise, right? Where Rotter really put something new is he talked about this locus of control. And what this means is that this is the perception of what is controlling your behavior. If you believe that if you have an internal locus of control, that means you believe that you have power, you have self-efficacy, you have power to act, right? You have power to act and determine your behavior and influence your own life. External locus of control is like saying, it's up to other people or fate. that your behavior, your perception of your behavior and the causes of your behavior is that it's caused by factors external to you. So you could talk about God or fate or your family or your whatever, things external to you, the bad day or so forth. Expectancy is just whether or not you believe that a behavior will end up with a reward, get your reward or not. Okay, so this really determines what you do because people do what they believe will be rewarded, right? Makes sense. Okay, so what is the current take? What do we believe this? Behaviorism is, a lot of research showing how important self-efficacy is, right? Certainly social cognitive learning can affect us, but it doesn't really take into mental processes. The social cognitive does, but the pure reinforcement part doesn't really. Remember, we talked about the cognitive revolution in psychology, and we had the behaviorists, and they really didn't want to study anything because they didn't believe you could study the darkness behind the eyes. They thought you could only study observable behavior, right? So their perspective doesn't really take into consideration what might be going on in people's minds, right? Social cognitive view, yes, it does. And there's a lot of, yes, it's been tested, you can test it. And there is evidence that yes, we do, not only do we learn from others, those social things influence us, but also we can influence, our own behavior and feelings with mental processes, right? Okay. Humanism. Any questions so far on the behaviorism learning theories? We learn our personality and who we are. So what about humanism? We've talked about humanism before. We talked about Maslow's pyramid. Remember that? Okay, so humanism really focuses on what makes us human, right? Our subjective feelings. Contrary to the determinism of the learning theorists, humanists believe we are free to choose who we are. We have freedom of choice. We have some ability to determine our own behavior. Remember, the goal of all this is self-actualization. Remember that? We talked about that before. Again, reaction against the negativity. Really, it's a third force, right? Third force. We have psychoanalysis, we have deterministic nature of behaviorism, and then we had Carl Rogers and Maslow, who really focused more on, positive psychology. It ended up as positive psychology. Okay. So starting with Carl Rogers. All right, my allergies are kind of getting out of control here. He believed that we all felt the need to reach self-actualization. This means that humans are born wanting to strive to meet their own potential, right? To do the best they can to find out what it is that they're most capable of doing and pursuing it, right? Really talked a lot about self-concept. We talked about self-concept last week. I have this memory of doing it, but I don't remember in what context, but I think we did. That's what you think of yourself. What is important to you and who you are. So here we have a definition: image of oneself that develops from interactions with important, significant people in your life and from other things, right? The self archetype that works with the ego to manage other archetypes and balance the certain personality. So your self-concept is who you are and who you want to be. So Carl Rogers talked about real self versus ideal self. We did talk about that last week in terms of romantic relationships. I think I mentioned how it's good if your significant other is closer to your ideal self rather than your real self. Makes sense. If your real self is cranky and nasty in the morning, it's better to be with someone who's going to encourage you not to be that way, right? Well, I'm not sure. Anyway, real self is how you believe your actual characteristics, traits, and abilities are. So notice perception, your own perception. Does this mean that how you view your real self, is that necessarily your real self? No, we all, it's subjective, right? But it's who we believe we are versus your ideal self, and that's who you would like to be, right? So we have this on the next slide. We have Rogers' ideal and real self. So what you want something like this top overlap. So a lot of research in psychology or theories, they use the concept of overlapping circles to understand how much we identify. Like you could have your group, your in-group and you, how much of an overlap. Well, here your ideal and your real self. The more similar you believe your real self is to your ideal self, the happier you're going to be, right? The better the match, more harmony. When you believe that the gap between your ideal self and your real self is huge, you're going to be anxious about it. Makes sense, right? More anxiety. Okay, and that's going to cause, neurotic behavior and so forth. So the goal of, for example, positive psychologists, when it comes to humanists, when it comes to like therapy, is to help the client get their real self more in line with the ideal self. And of course, they believe that it's possible to do that because they believe that we have some sort of power, that we have power over who we are and how we act. So humanists, so positive regard, humanists really believe that you should offer, as therapists, for example, they want to offer clients unconditional positive regard. That just means you are accepted without conditions or strings. This means like, ideally be like unconditional love. You're going to love someone just for who they are and not who you would like them to be. That would be conditional positive regard. That's like when you are given support only when you're doing what the person wants, right? So we've all had bad relationships, and sometimes they're inevitable. Like you're like your family, you get in trouble and you're with your parents. Okay, if they're only giving you positive regard when you're doing what they want, that's conditional. Humanism believes that that is not as healthy for helping the individual reach their goals, of who their ideal self goals. So a fully functioning person, according to a humanistic perspective, is someone who's in touch with their deepest, innermost urges and feelings. Not only in touch with, but understanding and self-compassionate. So remember Freud said you couldn't know anything. You have all this id underneath the water, that there's no way that you can't. It's not like you can't trust it for one thing, because it's wanting to have sex with inappropriate people possibly, and everything else that can happen. But also you can never access it, right? Humanistic perspective thought that yes, you could be in touch with your innermost urges, right? And that it was important to be that, so you could work on narrowing that gap between the real and the ideal self. So what do we think about this? What does the research say? Well, first, it's a little too rosy, right? Realistically speaking, things aren't that positive, really. You can't test it scientifically. This is very similar to Freudian's theory, is that if you can't test something, if you can't make testable hypotheses, we can't gather evidence that it's going to, that it's true at all. And so a lot of this is very rosy, can't really show, there's some research on the ideal versus the real self, okay, it's interesting, but still not as much empirical evidence as we would like. And then there's the connection to positive psychology, which we talked about before with Martin Seligman and getting over the shocking of the dogs and so forth. Okay, any questions on the humanistic view? I think we have time for one more before we break. Trait theories of personality. The most fun part of this chapter is personality assessment, but we'll leave that we'll get to that Wednesday. Hopefully we can start a little bit of chapter 14 Wednesday too. So, and Mark, by the way, I think I fixed the document. I think you should be able to download the appropriate PDF, but let me know if
Yes,
not.
it's all well.
Okay, good.
It's all updated.
Okay, good. Okay, so trait theories that endeavor to describe the characteristics that make up human personality in an effort to predict future behavior. So the idea here is that you're going to assess a person or measure a person's personality and be able to say, okay, so people who are agreeable are more likely to act in a morally acceptable way. So the idea is to be able to predict behavior based on personality. So that very first day of class, we talked about personality, psychology being about, describing, et cetera, and predicting behavior. Well, here we go, predicting behavior. So a trait is a consistent, enduring way of thinking, feeling, or behaving. So trait, we talk about measurement, which we will, measuring personality. Traits are something that last. So we already talked about personality as being something that's relatively permanent, right? So traits are relatively permanent, right? They are permanent. When we talk about measuring things, we talk about trait measures versus state. So a state is how you feel right now, and a trait is how you are in general. So talk about happiness. If it's state happiness, that just means how happy you are right now and how happy you've been in the last couple weeks. Whereas trait is, do you generally tend to be a happy person? Does that make sense? Okay. Trait theorists, Alpert and Cattell, okay? Gordon Alpert did a lot of interesting stuff. He had a list of 200 traits supposed to be part of the nervous system, a bit of overkill there. Cattell are 16, so 16 personality traits via factor analysis. So factor, he's a statistician. So one of the things you guys have to think about is that computers have made a huge difference in the testing of theories, right? And what will be impossible to, or very difficult to do by hand, like a factor analysis, if you ever study statistics, you'll learn about it. Computers have made it really possible. So people, as psychology has advanced, they've really tried to propose theories that could be tested, and our ability to test things is much increased now because we have computers to do all the math. Whereas if we had to do it, we'd be there for 5 years, right? So anyway, Cattell used factor analysis. He proposed we had 16 different traits here. So surface traits and source traits. Surface traits, just like what it sounds, surface traits can be seen by other people in how you behave, right? Source traits, those are the ones that are kind of underlie the surface traits, and they're the core, right? So introversion, dimension of personality in which people tend to withdraw from excessive stimulation. So introverts, if you're an introvert, that's a source trait that then can explain or account for or causes some of the behaviors or surface traits, okay? So big five, I kind of mentioned in passing already, personality. Usually when we talk about personality and measuring personality, and we'll see that on Wednesday, we're talking about the big five-factor personality model. Okay, so the idea here is that we have 5 main factors that explain our personality or underlie our personality. So openness to experience is the first one. Just willingness to try new things and be open to new experiences. A lot of research has been done on this now, and openness to experience is reliably related to a lot of things. Okay, so it tells us a lot about people. Conscientiousness, that's how conscientious you are, how careful you are about organizing, being organized, thoughtful, dependable, reliable at work, and so forth. Willing to, get you predictably get the job done, etc. Extroversion versus introversion, that's how willing and eager you are to be with other people. Agreeableness, okay, so easygoing, friendly, likable to grumpy, crabby, and unpleasant. Just how agreeable you are, just like what it sounds like. Neuroticism, degree of emotional instability or stability. And some people take issue with calling it neuroticism. It's really about emotional reactivity. So either way is good. But anyway, these are the 5. Some people also add, okay. Here's your, let me see here. Some people add a 6th one, which is humility. I think it's humility. So there's I think we're going to talk about that a little bit on Wednesday. So these main 5, you can put it in that acronym OCEAN. Openness, this is why I always talk about it this way. It helps you remember it. OCEAN, right? And high score, creative, artistic, curious, imaginative. Low scores, conventional, down to earth, uncreative, non-conforming. I don't know about the non-conforming. Openness to experience has been associated with people who read more fiction and watch more fiction on television, who, especially like the out there kind of stuff, like, you know, horror and sci-fi and so forth. And a lot of different things, also with intellectual humility, which is not on here, but humility is sometimes on here. Organized, conscientiousness, I already told you about this. Organized, reliable, neat, ambitious. Low scores, unreliable, lazy, careless, negligent, spontaneous. Interesting fact, you know, I've collected a lot of data online, and when you collect data online, it really depends on how willing people are to take time to fill out your survey. People who are conscientious are more likely to complete your survey and not to just select the same thing all the way through. So they're easier to study, which of course is problematic because we need to be able to study people who aren't conscientious just as well as people who are conscientious, right? Extroversion. If you're extroverted, you're talkative, optimistic. I don't know how much optimism has to do with it. Anyway, sociable, affectionate. If you're introverted, the other side is introverted, you know, just less wanting to be with people less, right? Let's see, agreeableness. Same thing, good natured, trusting, helpful, rude, uncooperative, irritable. Agreeableness is positively correlated with morality in general, right? People who are agreeable want to please others, so they're more likely to want to be a cooperative member of society, if that makes sense. That said, I'm sure not very agreeable in the morning, but I still try to be a cooperative member of society. Anyway, neuroticism. High score, worrying, insecure, anxious, temperamental. Low score is calmer, secure, relaxed, stable, right? Just what it sounds like. Okay, so current take. Trait, situation, interaction. Basically, that even though we have these traits, these enduring character, personality characteristics, that how we act in any given moment is going to depend on the environment, right? So there's a big interaction with the environment or situation, right? And what is certainly true is the 5-factor model seems to be evident in many cross-culturally. So there is something to it. And basic, you know, future research needs to show how much different things can influence it, but there's a lot of evidence that yes, we can talk broadly that people have some degree of openness or not. They have some degree of conscientiousness or not. So there's a lot of evidence that people are like this, that there are true individual differences in personality, and they are related to different aspects of behavior. How they relate really depends on that situation and sometimes on the culture. That makes sense. Okay, so I think we'll leave biological theories and personality assessment, which is kind of fun. We'll leave that for Wednesday. Are there any questions? All right, well, see you Wednesday.
Bye, Professor. Take care. Stay safe.
You too. I think I got everybody.